affairs yesterday. That's what the bell ringer is about. What did you learn about 1950s foreign affairs? What you typed in the chat. And then hopefully we're able to get through some of the maps. Each of these, of course, you just need to go through them and try the best you can. But if you'd like the extra points, you need to get 100%. Take a screenshot and submit each of those. But segregation in America. First off, after the Civil War, Jim Crow laws created segregation. Jim Crow laws created segregation. So separate schools, separate water fountains, separate pools. Everything was separate. And this is what we refer to as de jure. That is spelled D-E, second word J-U-R-E. That's D-E, second word J-U-R-E. And that just simply means by law. And the Supreme Court confirmed this with the case Plessy versus Ferguson. So the Supreme Court confirmed it with Plessy versus Ferguson. You don't have to write any of this down, but that case just involved a man by the name of Plessy, who actually wasn't even full African American. I believe only one of his great-grandparents was. And he wanted to ride the same rail car, of course, as those that were white, but it was forbidden. So he ended up suing over that particular law and the rule on the train that the company had, and went to the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court said as long as you can provide separate facilities that are somehow equal, then segregation should be allowed. So that's where the phrase, even though they didn't use it literally, separate yet equal, comes from. But of course, as we know, none of the facilities were ever equal. In the North, it was slightly different. So segregating in the North was a little bit different. In the North, it was referred to as de facto, which is D-E, second word F-A-C-T-O. So in the North, it was de facto. And that just means as a matter of fact. So in a lot of the North, it wasn't a law necessarily. It's just how people lived. Whites lived on one part of town, blacks lived on another part of town. So for instance, in the town that I grew up near, one of my professors, she was white and she had a friend that was black. They both started the same year, and this was in the 1970s. So it wasn't a super long time ago. And she was taken to be shown houses in one part of town, and her friend was taken to be shown houses in the black part of town, even though they had the same job and made the same amount of money. So that was something that went on in the North. So a lot of people like to think, oh, segregation was a Southern thing, but it still did happen in the northern states too. And so there was a significant impact of segregation. And so there are four big impacts that it had. The first one was low-paying jobs and poverty. Low-paying jobs and poverty. A lot of businesses, including in the North, paid African Americans less money. Low-paying jobs and poverty. Second one was illiteracy. Second one was illiteracy. Even though there were school systems for African Americans, they had a lot less resources, less encouragement to stay in school, and so there was a higher illiteracy rate. Third one would be less home ownership. Less home ownership. And you might think, what does it make a difference if someone owns or rents a home? Well, if you own a home, you have something to pass on to the next generation. You have something of value that you can borrow against for future loans. So African Americans had less access to these kinds of things. And the fourth one would be less voting. Less voting. Now, it's particularly true in the South. North, this one wouldn't be much of an issue. But in the South, some laws were specifically meant to stop African Americans from voting. One was a poll tax, which was a fee that impacted African Americans a lot more. You had to pay in order to vote. Another one was a literacy test, which wasn't carried consistently. So if you were white and you came to vote, you'd be asked, how do you spell your name? And if an African American came up to vote, they would be asked to recite Article 3 of the state constitution. So there was a big discrepancy in how the laws were carried out. And then, of course, something we've mentioned before, but in 1954 will be Brown versus Board of Education, which we've already mentioned, so I won't explain it too much, but remember, this is the case that desegregated the school system. And this really started the public recognition that the separate facilities were not equal, and they inherently harmed people's rights. And so the civil rights movement will continue to grow. One organization was CORE, C-O-R-E. C-O-R-E, which was the Congress of Racial Equality. And they organized protests. It also started to grow because you started to see Black Americans participating in sports. In the past, they had been segregated from it, but people like Jackie Robinson, for instance, who's African American, started to play. So having Black athletes was incredibly significant because it would be really the first time that a lot of white Americans would even see an African American in some parts of the country. And you started to see it in politics too. Truman desegregated the military. Truman desegregated the military. And then there was this organization, the NAACP. And they become the largest civil rights organization that would sue to stop segregation. The largest civil rights organization that would sue to stop segregation. And one of the reasons why all this started happening was because it was post-World War II. African Americans had fought bravely in a number of places in Europe and Asia. And so many of them returned home saying, wait, we sacrificed for our country, so why do we have to use separate buses? And why do we have to send our kids to different schools? So World War II helped reinforce the idea of equality because many African Americans had served in the military. Oops. I was not supposed to have all that up there. I'm not going to make you write down all of that, but just write down the names in particular. Notable leaders: Thurgood Marshall.
See, what's so hard?
Because believe me, it takes people longer when they have to type down everything on a slide. And there's numerous studies to show that it's not an effective way to transmit information. So Thurgood Marshall, Rosa Parks, and Dr. Martin Luther King. So one thing you can write down about Thurgood Marshall is that he was a lawyer and later a Supreme Court justice. He was a lawyer and later on a Supreme Court justice. Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat because at the time, if enough white people entered a bus in this particular city, blacks had to move to the back. So she refused to do that, refused to give up her bus seat. Well, when you're a teenager, yes, the back of the bus is the best part. But if you're a working woman who's been on her feet all day, she just wants to hurry up and sit down. But this issue of Rosa Parks, because she ended up getting arrested for this, started the Montgomery bus boycott. And the only thing you need to write down here underneath this is that it started Martin Luther King's protests, or at least the ones that got noticed publicly. Started Martin Luther King's protest. And the Supreme Court ruled bus segregation was unconstitutional. So helped start Martin Luther King's protests. And it was ruled unconstitutional. So the effects of all this was that it showed peaceful protest worked. So the effects of the boycott and the Supreme Court victory were that peaceful protests could work.
What's so bad about knowing that?
What's that again?
What's so bad about knowing that?
What's so bad about knowing that?
Yeah.
You mean what's so good about knowing that?
Well, you made it sound like it was a bad thing that they found out that peaceful protests were.
Well, it was a revelation because a lot of people doubted that. Some people said that the only way to achieve any type of victory was through violence. So it was surprising that these peaceful protests ended up working out. But anyway, King also helped establish the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. King established the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And so when King helped establish the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, it showed what he was basically going to use. He was going to use churches in order to fight for civil rights.
Jesus.
But churches weren't the only ones involved. Eventually, college students in Greensboro helped protest segregated lunch counters. College students in Greensboro helped protest segregated lunch counters because people that were black were not allowed to sit at a lunch counter close to where the food was being made or served. So this led to one of the more widespread uses of nonviolence, which were sit-ins, where groups of people would go and just sit down at the counters in order to protest. Of course, this led to arrests. Often white customers, whenever this was done, would dump food on the people sitting at the lunch counters to try to get rid of them. So there were some counter protests. I think there is a picture here. Yeah, there's one of them getting food dumped on them. And the next one we won't mention too much because we already talked about it before, of course, the Little Rock Nine. The 9 students in that city that were allowed to attend high school, but of course they had to be protected by troops. And so even though Brown versus Board happened, obviously it was going to be a long path. Since only one of them ended up graduating from high school there, the bullying and harassment was too much, so the others ended up going to school somewhere else. So there's actually only one African American from that group that graduated from the high school. But this was just the beginning of civil rights, and obviously it will continue on to the 60s and 70s, which we'll talk more about later on in the class. So from the remainder of the period, make sure you finish up the maps activity, or one of the other things that we've done, the media activity, the reading. For instance, this is the last day of the notes. So you put comments in the margin on the left-hand side and a summary down at the bottom, and then go ahead and submit the notes for a grade. So make sure that you do that. And you can also move ahead if you would like to take the quiz, for instance, for the unit, you can do that as well.